chemistry is the foundation of life, and so we need to spend a little bit of time talking about matter and how it affects life. So matter is anything that takes up space and it has mass. Matter is made up of chemical substances, and these chemical substances are made up of atoms and compounds. Matter will have a definite composition, meaning that for each type of matter, the composition is constant. So for example, when we look at water's composition will always have 2 hydrogen atoms bonded to 1 oxygen atom. And it doesn't matter how much water you have, it doesn't matter what state the water is in, the composition will always have this 2-to-1 ratio. An element is a pure substance. It is the smallest piece of matter, and it is made up of only 1 type of atom. The atom is the smallest particle of an element that still has the properties of that element. There are currently 118 known elements, and you can see them on the periodic table. These last 5 or so are still currently receiving further studies to verify that they truly are unique elements and then their name. Most elements are metals. As you can see from the periodic table, the metals are shaded in the blue. So examples of metals are iron and copper, and they are good conductors of electricity and heat. Non-metals, there's fewer of them. If you notice, they're in the green on the periodic table, like hydrogen and oxygen, and they do not have the properties of metals. They cannot conduct electricity or heat. Elements can combine to form compounds. So a compound is a substance that consists of 1 or more elements. Each compound has a unique composition. And that composition is always the same. So like I said, for water, the composition is always H2O. Or for table salt, we always have NaCl. And then the molecule is the smallest particle of a compound. And so here in this diagram, we have a picture of 1 molecule of water. If we were to add another oxygen atom, bonded to a hydrogen, now there's a total of 2 water molecules. So the bonds that hold atoms together to form chemicals are called chemical bonds. This is the force that holds molecules together, and they form when substances react. Chemical reactions are those processes that change some chemical substance into others, and it's needed to form the compounds. Some chemical reactions can actually separate compounds into their unique elements. So we can go from having NaCl or sodium chloride, and there's a reaction out there that will break it down into sodium and the chlorine. So in biology, one of the most important elements is carbon. And carbon is found in organic compounds. And these compounds are found in living things, and they are primarily made up of carbon atoms. Organic compounds make up the cells in our bodies and other structures of organisms, and they have the ability to carry out life processes. So when you see this term life processes, you should think of chemical reactions needed for life. So an example of that would be like the reactions dealing with digesting food would be one type of life process. So carbon is essential to all life on Earth, And a couple reasons why is that it can form stable bonds with many elements. And the unique thing is that it includes itself. It can form up to 4 bonds with itself. This allows carbon to form very big variety and very large and complex molecules. There are nearly 10 million carbon-based compounds in living things, and these 10 million compounds get grouped into just 4 major types. We have the carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And so many of these you've probably heard even in advertising, like a low-carb diet or high-protein diet. And so these large macromolecules are built from smaller molecules that we call monomers. So, and then remember, macro means large or big. So if we have a macromolecule, it is a big molecule. And they form from a dehydration reaction. And a dehydration simply removes a water molecule in order to make the macromolecules. And so that kind of makes sense, because if you're dehydrated, you're lacking water. So this table right here gives you actually a really good overview of the 4 types of organic compounds. It gives you the examples, the elements found in each of these types of compounds. It gives you their functions, and it tells you what their single smaller molecules that join together are. So like for carbohydrates, monosaccharides join together to form big carbohydrates. So now we're going to take a look at each of these 4 types of organic molecules in a little bit more detail. So carbohydrates are organic compounds such as sugar or starch, and their function is used to store energy. And they're built of small repeating units. Remember, we call those the monomers. If you remember, prefix mono means 1, so 1 single unit. So a monosaccharide is a simple sugar such as fructose or glucose that are the building blocks of carbohydrates. And so mono means 1, and so saccharide means sugar. So a monosaccharide is 1 sugar molecule. Fructose is found in fruit, and glucose is the result of the digestion of other carbohydrates. And we use glucose for energy in our cells, and actually most organisms use glucose for that. A polysaccharide then is a chain of monosaccharides. And this makes up the complex carbohydrates. Your prefix poly means many. And so an example here would be starch. They can range, starch molecules or polysaccharides can range in size from a few simple sugars to a few thousand. And so polysaccharides' main functions are to store energy and then form structures of living things. So here we have 4 examples of types of carbohydrates, and it's going to be important for you to know what they do and what where they're found. So starch is used by plants, and the important part here is that it is used in plants to store energy. So an example would be a potato is a very starchy plant. Glycogen is now used by animals to store energy. Cellulose, again, is only found in plants, and this forms the rigid walls around the cells. And then chitin, again, is only used by animals, and this forms the external skeleton. It's what makes bugs kind of crunchy. And so this is a good example of how carbohydrates are used to store energy. So this side is all about storing energy. And this right-hand side is where it talks about building structures in organisms. So our second class of organic molecules are lipids. Lipids are organic compounds such as fats and oils. Again, they're used to store energy, and they're also found in the cell membranes, and they can serve as chemical messengers within cells. So their repeating units, or their monomers, are called fatty acids. And there are two types of fatty acids. We can have saturated and unsaturated fatty acids. So a saturated fatty acid is a molecule in which lipids have carbon atoms that bond to as many hydrogen atoms as possible. It forms a straight chain. There's no bends in it, and they can be packed very tightly together. You can see in the picture here, they can sit right on top of one another. And this allows them to store energy in a very compact form. They are solids at room temperature because they can, I kind of think of like Legos when I think of them. They snap together. There's no spaces in between them when they're stacked up on top of one another. And so in my mind, that just makes it look like a brick of butter or something like that. Saturated fatty acids are used by animals to store energy. When we look at unsaturated fatty acids, we'll notice that they're molecules in lipids in which some carbon atoms are bonded to other groups of atoms instead of just hydrogen atoms. Usually we'll see a double bond somewhere in the chain between two carbon atoms. And when we get that double bond, you'll notice that we get a little bend or a little kink in the chain. So they can't pack together, and therefore they can't pack together tightly. And so therefore they are liquids at room temperature. Unsaturated fatty acids are used by plants to store energy. And so this is where we get oils. Oils are liquid. And if we look at like olive oil or what is the other one? You can get like avocado oil, and they all come from plants. So lipids can contain fatty acids alone, or fatty acids can be bonded to other molecules. So some lipids will have alcohol molecules or phosphate groups bonded to them as well. And so there are three types of lipids. The first is a triglyceride. This is the main form of lipid found in animals. And you might hear the word triglycerides in like cholesterol medication commercials because it deals with the fats in cholesterol. Phospholipids are the major components of cell membranes. And then lastly, steroids are chemical messengers, and they have other roles, or they can have other roles. On to our third type of organic molecule, we have proteins. Proteins are organic compounds, and they're made up of amino acids. And so an amino acid is a small molecule that is a building block of proteins, and there are 20 different amino acids. Small proteins will contain a few hundred amino acids, where bigger proteins can contain up to thousands of amino acids. And so protein structure is actually pretty complex, but the basic structure, or the first kind of level, is the polypeptide. And this is a chain of amino acids that can be alone or with other such chains, and they make up a protein. So when I think of a polypeptide, I think back to like elementary school when you'd put like colored noodles on a string for your mom for Mother's Day and make a necklace. So the colored noodles would each represent a single amino acid. Proteins can have up to 4 levels of structure. The primary level would be the most simple of the 4 structures, all the way down to quaternary would be the most complex. The complex structure of proteins give them their unique properties. If we look at the diagram, we'll notice that the secondary structure can have one of 2 forms. It can have the pleated sheets form, or it can have the helix. And so the pleated sheets, I kind of think of folding the paper back and forth, and we get that accordion style fold. And then a helix just has a twist. Tertiary structure is when there are certain attractions between alpha helixes and pleated sheets, and so it combines the 2 secondary structures. And then lastly, we have our quaternary structure, which is very complex, and this consists of more than 1 amino acid chain. So proteins help keep help cells keep their shape. They make up muscle tissue, and they help speed up chemical reactions, and we call those enzymes. They are also part of antibodies, and antibodies are part of the immune system. And their job is to bind to foreign substances and target them for destruction. An example here is the hemoglobin protein. So hemoglobin is a protein, and it's found in our red blood cells, and oxygen will bind to the red blood cells, and it will carry the oxygen from the lungs to cells throughout the body. Our last group of organic molecules are nucleic acids, and these are organic compounds such as DNA or RNA, and their monomer is called nucleotides. A nucleotide is a small molecule that contains a sugar, a phosphate group, and a nitrogen base. A polynucleotide will be when we have many nucleotides bound together. In DNA, we have 2 polynucleotide chains, and RNA only has the 1 polynucleotide chain. So when we look at the structure of nucleic acids, we're going to notice that each nucleotide will have 1 sugar, 1 phosphate group, and 1 nitrogen base. The sugar of 1 nucleotide will bind or bond to the phosphate group of the next nucleotide. This forms the backbone. And then we'll have the nitrogen bases that stick out from that backbone. And there are 4 nitrogen bases. We have cytosine, it's abbreviated with a C, guanine, again abbreviated with a G, adenine, it's abbreviated with an A, and then lastly we have thymine, abbreviated with a T. These 4 are all found in DNA, and there is a 5th base, uracil, U, and this is only found RNA, and it replaces thymine. So in RNA there is no thymine, it's replaced with uracil. Bonds will form between bases on the 2 nucleotide chains of DNA, and it holds the chains together. This bonding always happens in a specific order, where cytosine will always bond with guanine and adenine will always bond with thymine. We refer to this rule as the complementary base pairs, and it's the pairing of nucleotide bases that bond together. So again, A pairs with T, C pairs with G. So when we look at the structure of DNA, it would be a double helix. Double because there's 2 strands to it, and a helix because it has a little twist to it, like a spiral staircase. So if we look closely, we can see here's our phosphate group. You know that it's a phosphate group because of the phosphorus molecule there in the middle. Our phosphorus group is then bonded to our sugar. So here's our sugar. And then the sugar is bonded to the nitrogen containing base. And you'll notice that the two bases of the opposite strands bond together. This double helix forms naturally, and it's very, very strong, so it makes it hard to break these bonds holding the bases together. And so it's hard to pull the two polynucleotide chains apart. So DNA is found in our genes, in all living things genes, and the order of the DNA bases creates a code, and everybody has a unique code, and it carries instructions for the correct sequences of amino acids in a protein. And there's a whole chapter later on down the road here that deals with this whole process. RNA uses the information in DNA to assemble the correct amino acids to help make the protein. And then information in DNA is passed from parent to daughter cell. This info from the DNA is passed from the parents of offspring, or parents to offspring when organisms reproduce as well.